Let me just start by saying I want to thank Ashley for having included me in the group of contributors. He's provided excellent guidance in the structuring of the essays, and I have enjoyed the experience a great deal. I'm going to make 3 quick points. I was told as a youngster that a good sermon has 3 parts to it, 3 points, and if I can just point to those 3 points, it's late in the day, and as I touch them, the basic thrust of this is that there has been an economic response in Russia, which is triggering a political crisis, point number 2, which will affect the international behavior of the Russian government and has impact on all of Asia. The economic story, part 1 of my 3 points, is pretty straightforward. You've seen many of the headlines, and Joe Biden sort of nailed it when he was in Kiev. The stock market dropped 75% as the crisis began. The ruble dropped about 35% in value in the course of the first months of the crisis. The drop in the stock market value triggered collateral calls because many of the oligarchs had borrowed against the inflated value of their stock. In the London markets, money was cheap. Moscow has virtually no banking system. It has a very immature banking system, and people were afraid of lending to corporations. So most of that was foreign debt that then had to be restructured. There is still to this day $400 billion of corporate debt owed to Western financial institutions that has not been restructured. So the economic issues continue. The title for the essay was The Consequences of Delayed Reform, and the reform has been delayed in Russia largely because oil went up in value, and the Russians have plenty of oil and plenty of gas as well as other resources, and have continued to rely during the Putin regime, which we are still in. 66% of all export revenues in 2008 were from oil and gas. 45 to 65% of the state budget comes from taxes taken from the sale of oil and gas. As I point out in the essay, the Russian government has tried to disguise this. If you look at their GDP numbers, it looks like they're just another European country with an industrial sector and a technology sector and a service sector, and then there's this mineral extraction thing. But the total GDP allocated for mineral extraction, so all metals as well as the energy resources, which roll up under that, is $128 billion a year. Export sales alone in 2008 were $310 billion. So they are taking their local internal prices to project GDP and minimize the importance of that sector, while in fact they're receiving the benefit of the world prices for those same resources. As a result of this reliance on oil and gas, we have not seen industrial restructuring. A large part of the country is still faced with the fact that the Soviet-era industries that were built have not been put through the process of either being eliminated or brought into the modern era in terms of manufacturing techniques, efficiency, accountability in terms of capital utilization. Instead, we've seen an increase in the amount of corrupt payments related to both the industrial sector and, in general, the running of the economy. You're all aware that the Putin regime has meant a great concentration of power in the hands of former KGB officers, people who were particularly Putin's friends, but to an even wider circle than that. And with this has come a decline in the strength of regional governments. Peter Botellier was talking about the importance of the local governments in China as a counterbalance to the central government. In Russia, power has been stripped away from those governments. The regional governors are appointed by the Kremlin, not directly elected any longer. And as a result, there is virtually no basis for resistance in the countryside. If oil and gas prices return to the levels that we saw at the height of last year, 150 or higher because of the erosion of the value of the dollar, and oil is sold in dollars, If we see a return to that level, this charade will continue. We will see the government continue to suck oil and gas revenue out, pay an enormous corrupt system, and it will sustain itself until the point at which the vast inefficiencies of the system take it down the way the Soviet Union was taken down, crumbled from the inside just due to the dead weight of a system that no longer functions. I know this sounds like fairly alarmist kind of talk, but one quick story that was just in the New York Times 2 weeks ago. IKEA, one of the largest retailers in Russia and famous for having built a worldwide business, acknowledged recently that they had, when they built their first 2 regional centers, they were told by the local utility company, you will pay us a bribe or we won't turn on the electricity now that you've got this multi-thousand square meter facility built. And IKEA decided, rather than submitting to that kind of blackmail, to bring in their own generators. And so they brought in generators, turned them on, ran their first 2 facilities with their own power, and then made it a policy to, in fact, take those generators everywhere where they open a new facility. I was following this intimately because we were investors through the fund that I manage in the Russian equivalent of LensCrafter. It's called LensMaster in Russia, but started by Dean Butler, the same fellow. And we would go into each IKEA center as they opened them. As they went along with this self-sufficient strategy, they discovered that the guy they had hired to run the generator program was taking kickbacks from the generator companies to the tune of $160 million, which wiped out the profitability of the company for 5 years. They then went to court to sue on this, saying they had been damaged. The court told them, somewhere out in, I think in Novosibirsk, you have to make a €5 billion deposit just in case you lose this case. You put it with us, and we'll then hold the trial. That money disappeared, and when they went to court in St. Petersburg to complain that they both had not had a fair judgment and they had lost their money, that court found the manager of the generators innocent and pulled €5 billion from the St. Petersburg Citibank account of IKEA. So they lost their down payment twice, as well as losing their profitability, as well as having been taken for a ride. It's that level of corruption which is so mind-boggling that Westerners sometimes think that those of us who are in that market are exaggerating, but it continues. If oil and gas prices stay low, which seems from the scenarios that we're hearing here today, low in real terms, because the dollar is declining and we have the dollar and the ruble as currencies that, well, the ruble is denominated, is converted both at a dollar rate, which is now at about 30 rubles to the dollar, up from the low 20s before this crisis, and converted at a mixed euro-dollar rate, which is now at 39. If the euro continues to strengthen against the dollar, you can see that having a dollar-denominated key resource is that much more damaging to the Russians in terms of the buying power of their revenues. So if we stay with low or medium price recovery in terms of oil, the tensions within the government are bound to increase because something needs to happen in order to move the basic economy forward. And Medvedev, if you read his statements, is eloquent about the level of corruption, the need for technological innovation, the need for industrial restructuring, and is making that case very strongly, I think, because there is a constituency within the government that knows that this can't go on, that this thing has to stop at some point, and he is in some ways facilitating that continued discussion. That said, the Anti-Corruption Commission, which he recently appointed, is headed by someone who is known in the community there for one of the most flagrant violations of KGB taking of corrupt payments. In fact, he was removed from his FSB position because he had taken bribes beyond the acceptable levels, and he's the chairman of the commission. It's just, again, mind-boggling how this gets done. The reason why the Russians may need to move forward on these discussions is because foreign investors are becoming more and more reluctant to attempt to come into the country. And as you see the capital available for internal regeneration of the economy shrink, they have a problem. So we may see some compliance with Western requirements for more transparency and accountability, but it's only going to be under the greatest of pressure. Very quickly, the effect on Asia. I know this is about Asia, and I would say that it's clear now that Russia is prepared to accept a supplier relationship with Northern Asia. The two large agreements reached in the past year, one with Japan on LPG from Sakhalin, which the Japanese have said is an important a relationship of strategic importance. The Kuril Islands issue still sits there unresolved, but apparently it's okay to now do business in a serious way. And the Russians accepted a $25 billion financing from the government of China to build a pipeline that is a dedicated pipeline into China that will supply 10% of the annual oil imports of China, which 8 years ago, Michael Khodorkovsky went to jail, exile, Siberia, for proposing exactly the same pipeline as a private company. So it's something the Russians have resisted. The price is not disclosed, but is at a deep discount to market prices, and indicates that Russia, as a player in Asia, at least in North Asia, is prepared to really just sort of bite the bullet and play the resource provider role. In Central Asia, it could be very different. The Russians don't like Nabucco. Those of us who watched the chatter noticed that Lavrov one day was in Baku saying we have no problem with the Nabucco pipeline. This is a pipeline that will basically go from Azerbaijan through to Europe and provide a line for natural gas that never touches Russian territory. They don't like that very much because they have Nord Stream and South Stream, looks a little like a pincer coming toward Europe. And that's exactly what it is, because it's two Russian pipelines that they don't have to put anything through Ukraine or other cranky people who may steal some of the supply out of the line. But the same day that Lavrov was saying, we have no problem with this, Putin was in Vienna saying, I don't know why they would even think of building this thing, because nobody's going to be able to supply it. No one's going to put gas into it. Azerbaijan, I think, sits at a very critical position right now. It's next to Iran. Iran would love to be able to fill natural gas, bring it into Europe. It could take supply from Russia, which would stabilize Russia's supply relationships, and it allows the Central Asian suppliers to begin to operate independent of Russia. And Russia continues to be a very not a very good partner. If you in the article, I gave one extensive example of Russian deceit and betrayal to their former subservient republics. On a global level, I think that we're going to see a continued push by the Russians against the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. Mr. Putin has been very clear on that. He's had some reluctant support from the Chinese. He's had some from India as well, sort of, well, we'll have to think about it. Sarkozy jumped on the bandwagon recently, too. But I think the Russians have now given it a new twist, which is they want to see a group of reserve currencies around the world. And, of course, the ruble should be one of those reserve currencies. Well, the ruble can be the reserve currency in where? The former Soviet space. So that means that Ukraine should be under their tutelage, as should Moldova and the other republics. I don't think they'll try to go back to the Baltics, but they'd like to see Central Asia as well in their economic sphere. Well, their economic sphere, given the primitive level of their own economy, means reimposing political control and asset stripping from within those economies. I don't believe that we're about to allow that to happen to Ukraine or to any of the Central Asian republics, but only time will tell. The last thing I would say is that in hearing the analysis from my colleagues, I'm struck by how much there's a sense of continuity of institutions and the sort of nuanced changes. What I think I'm pointing to with Russia is that there's a greater risk of a real discontinuity. That is, a break at some point where, and I've said this in the article, there's the possibility of a coup. That is that because there is no way to ventilate this discussion with the elite of the country, to look through rationally at what our alternatives are for development of this country, that at some point there may be a sudden moment where Putin decides he needs to be renamed president, or there is a military crisis because there's too much social unrest from continued failure of factories, and there has to be a military action, and therefore there's something that happens in terms of political control as well. And that will have a disruptive effect on all markets, the duration of which we have no way of knowing, but given Russia's key role in energy supplies, it will have impact. So I'll stop there.